It's the Elephant in the Dome, the official podcast of the Washington State Senate Republican Caucus. I'm Tracy Ellis with Senate Republican leader John Braun. Starbucks was founded here in Washington, in Seattle. We always think of Starbucks as a Seattle company. That seems to be changing. Now, Starbucks says they aren't leaving Seattle, but they are leasing a new space in Nashville, Tennessee. There's enough room there for 2,000 people. Is that something that, beyond a canary in a coal mine, we're hearing about companies moving all the time, but when you have a big company like Starbucks, that is such a big part of the identity of our state, expand to a place like Tennessee, is that something that people should be paying attention to?
Oh, I think absolutely. And you know, whether you, like you said, a canary in the coal mine or just, it's a high visibility. This is a Washington company. It's something that, like you said, is part of the identity of Washington State. And this is a big move. It's got a lot of attention, of course. But the idea that, they kind of soft pedal this and say, well, we're not moving the headquarters. You can't move that number of people and not really shift the center of gravity for the company in the process. This is an international company now, headquartered in Washington, but really have decided that Washington is no longer the best place to do business. And the Democratic majority seems to have either not ever known or forgotten, the basic economic principles that allowed Washington companies to compete in Washington and around the country and around the world. And they've created a situation where they're at a disadvantage and they're making very rational decisions that if they're going to compete in the marketplace, they have to put themselves geographically in a place that doesn't penalize them for their success. And this is, the poster child that's got all the coverage, but I can tell you there are hundreds, maybe thousands of companies who are either in the middle of doing the same thing or thinking about the same thing. They're looking at their market. They're trying to figure out how, given the enormous new taxes of last year and then this income tax that was put in place by the Democratic majority this year, it is very much aimed at, small and medium businesses. Businesses, 50 to 500 people. They're, by most standards, are still small, but they're growing, and they're growing to, to 200 to 1,000 people, and that's the economic growth in our state in the next 5 to 10 years. And now they're saying, hey, as we compete around the country, this new tax situation we have in Washington State is going to hold us at a significant disadvantage to our competitors, and they're making rational decisions to look other places, and in many cases, like Starbucks, make firm decisions. And we're going to have a lot big and small companies. They don't put out a press release. They don't tell anybody. They just make the decision. Same as we're having people do exactly that. I talked to two more people yesterday of significant means that have left the state. And they didn't tell anybody. I would have known. I just happened to talk to them on the phone, and they're like, no, I don't live there anymore. That is happening over and over again, and there is a real long-term economic effect to our state and the not just the revenues or the growth, but the economic opportunity for other folks, because there just won't be the investment in Washington we have seen over the last few decades.
If you go to the Washington State Senate Republican Caucus website and click on the Exit WA, you'll see some stories of people leaving Washington, and you could submit, if you're leaving, or if you know of someone who's leaving, you could submit your story there. We've had over 100 individuals tell us that they're leaving Washington so far for a variety of reasons, but it mostly comes down to one thing, and it's affordability. It's for some people, the income tax was the straw that broke the camel's back, but there's the death tax, there's the capital gains tax, there were increases in all the taxes that Democrats say are regressive, sales taxes, they added new sales taxes. So there were a lot of things. On top of that, you've got the third highest gas prices in the nation. Our state is in the top 5, usually among the most expensive, most unaffordable in the nation. Obviously, housing prices. You've got a lot of things here that are causing this. But, let's go back to Starbucks for a second. Maybe, is it the political climate? The mayor of Seattle, after she was elected, was urging people to boycott Starbucks for a while. I mean, this is the mayor of the city where this company is headquartered.
It absolutely is the climate. And, the wonderful thing about the private sector, the economy in our state and in our country is it's amazingly resilient. They can take almost any situation they're placed in and find a way to succeed, but they have to have some level of stability. They have to be able to plan for it. And there's no sense of stability here in Washington State. 2 years in a row, the largest tax increases in our state history, not by just a little bit, but like an order of magnitude each time. And virtually no meaningful input taken by the Democratic majority from the business community. They just said, here, deal with this. And companies can't deal with it like that. They're innovative, responsive, they're adaptive, but they can't keep having to jump over new bars that the state Democratic majority puts in their place and be successful when other companies don't have those barriers, don't have those distractions, don't have those costs. And it's all adding up to as I said earlier, very rational decision that they're going to have to go everywhere else. And look, I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying here and fighting like many people, but I don't blame them. I mean, they're just trying to survive and trying to prosper. And the majority keeps, making it harder and harder and harder. And that's ultimately going to end up with higher costs for everyone. In particular, it's something I think is important to point out. It gets a lot of news when Jeff Bezos or Howard Schultz leaves the state. But what about all the middle income folks who can't afford to leave the state? They just going to have to, they just have to somehow deal with the higher cost of living with fewer and fewer options. Those are the folks who I feel the worst for, is these repeated poor decisions by the Democratic majority that drive up the costs from fuel to gas to housing to childcare to healthcare, are making it very unaffordable here in the state of Washington. And the average Washingtonian can do very little about it.
That's where it becomes a problem, right? You can't make adjustments, right? We've all dealt with this, right? With our personal budgets, we have to make adjustments sometimes if we like we're trying to save more for retirement or that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. But if you can't make an adjustment because just the basic cost of things are so high, then it becomes a challenge for the individual, right? Absolutely.
And I would actually take that back to what the Democratic majority did in the legislature, and of course the governor signed it in the face of budget deficits. They don't have enough money the last 2 years, and they threw some big numbers out there. They misled the public a little bit on the nose, but they were big numbers. But what people don't often understand is it's billions of dollars shortfall, but this is on an $80 billion budget. As a percentage of the overall spending, it was 2, 3, 4%. If you had to adjust your family budget or your business budget by 2 or 3%, you might not like it, but you wouldn't. You'd find a way to do it. And instead of find a way to rein in spending, there's lots of ways you can do to take a few percentage off your spending. Instead of doing that, the Democratic majority said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to reach out and we're going to take more money from the citizens of the state. They have refused time and time again to get their spending in order, which is what, and again, this is a few percentage points, and I don't want to minimize it too much. It is still a hard problem, but it's a manageable problem, a problem that is well within our means to fix and not overspend what we have coming in. Instead, they've chosen for 2 years in a row to make record-breaking tax increases that are running people out of the state, that are reducing opportunities in the state, and driving up the cost for the people who can't always, do much about it.
I mean, there are things the legislature can do. Let's take gas prices, for example. The Climate Commitment Act is a big driver of that. Now, we know that the war in Iran has pushed up gas prices throughout the world. But they're higher, as we talked about earlier, they're higher here, third highest in the country. The legislature can do something about that with the Climate Commitment Act, right? Prices of housing, a lot of that comes down to regulations and fees and taxes and that sort of thing. The legislature can do something about that. These are the types of costs, these regressive costs, I guess, the Democrats call it, that they seem that majority Democrats seem to be concerned about, yet it just seems like they're indifferent to it for some reason, even though it's costing their constituents a lot of money and forcing some of them to leave.
I'm not convinced they are concerned about it. They may say they care about the folks in the middle or struggling with affordability, but they're not actually doing anything about it. And there's a lot of things that go into this, and it's hard to break down. But you hit on the most important thing in our state that's driving up costs, and that's the policy put in place by the majority that affects our energy prices. And there's a couple different bills. There's a Clean Energy Transformation Act, and there's the Climate Commitment Act, which is the cap and trade system. Both of these are driving up the cost of fuel. So when you fill up your car is one thing, but they're also driving up the cost of electricity. They're driving up the cost of natural gas. They're driving up the cost. And what's really important to understand here, it's not just that, hey, when you fill up your car or you pay your monthly utility bill, that price is higher. It is meaningfully higher, but it's also everything we purchase has a transportation component. So it is the number one thing we can do to bring costs down in the state of Washington is get after the price of fuel. And you're right, we have a short-term impact from the events in Iran that are driving it up. But when you look at the numbers, the bigger impact today is from the policy from the majority Democrats. And it's really even more frustrating, besides the deep frustration about affordability and the cost of living here in the state of Washington, is they're doing this all in the name of reducing carbon. But anybody that has the time on their hands and the interest can go look at how they're spending this money from the cap and trade system, what they're doing with it supposedly to reduce carbon. And it doesn't take very long to figure out it's not reducing carbon. It's being used for special interest that help the majority's friends. And if you really look at the numbers, almost no carbon is being reduced. And to the extent it is, we are reducing the emission carbon. We're paying 2 or 3 times the market rate for a reduction of a ton of carbon. It is right up there with the biggest failures coming out of the Democratic majority in recent years. I mean, there's some other big ones as well.
Housing. I mean, I would say that housing is, people can't afford. In Seattle, normal working class people cannot afford to buy a home. Where did that come from? How did that get so crazy?
I mean, it's a number of things, but I mean, but at the fundamental level, this is a supply and demand problem, right? You have fewer and fewer houses because there's fewer and fewer places to build houses, and therefore, when you don't have enough supply, it drives the price up. It's as simple as that. And when you can go to other places in the country and buy a starter home for half what you'd pay for one in Washington, and in Washington, you're probably buying an old beat up starter home, and you go to places like, some places in Texas as an example, and you can buy a brand new one for half the price. It's really a stark difference, and it's all about supply and demand. We have let the Growth Management Act, and I think there's some things everybody likes, about that. I mean, nobody wants urban sprawl, but we've let that drive the ship for 35 years now, and now we have just no economical land to build on. And the majority is beholden to the environmental folks who will stand in the way of any reasonable expansion. I was just talking to the mayor of a city down here in my district. They have a little 40-acre piece right next to their city. It is zoned as agriculture, but it hasn't been farmed in 30 years. It is surrounded by development. They have done a good job in density. This is a city that's really paid attention and tried to make sure they got plenty of density. It meets all the criteria that says, hey, that is a very logical piece of property to bring in to the urban growth area, to develop, to provide for more housing. And yet you have, folks at the county driven by organizations like FutureWise that are standing in the way of a very, very reasonable proposal that could help build more affordable housing. It's almost like they don't want housing, like they literally want fewer people in the state of Washington, which seems like a crazy idea, but that's what it appears like.
We pick our own governments. This is a republic, and the people are the ones who are in control of all this. The Central Puget Sound area tax themselves over and over again for light rail. It's very costly, and it's costing people in Seattle a lot of money. But light rail is actually part of a plan, and part of what's holding up the bridge in the Portland-Vancouver area over the Columbia River. The main bridge on I-5 there needs to be replaced, has all sorts of problems. Everybody agrees that needs to be replaced. It's expensive, really expensive. But light rail, there's a study that came out that said the light rail component, because a lot of people want to put light rail on that bridge. The light rail component would be $3.5 billion. When this whole thing started, that was going to be the cost of the entire bridge project. To replace that bridge was going to be $3.5 billion. Now that's just the light rail portion of it. And you're saying that they should just, forget the light rail, build the bridge, get it done before it gets even more expensive. Because with these transportation projects, the longer you wait, it seems like the more expensive it gets.
That's right. And I'll start with the last point first. Everything has gotten more expensive in that, including big transportation projects like this. And it's a direct result of the regulatory policy put in place by the majority. In this case, this is a bridge that could have been built 10 or 15 years ago for a fraction of the cost. And instead of looking at the actual problem, here's the actual problem. We got an old bridge. It is structurally sound, but there are genuine concerns about how it would hold up in, say, an earthquake. So it is due for replacement. So we have an old bridge that is reasonably due for replacement, and we have a congestion problem. Instead of dealing with those two problems, the Democrats in both Washington and Oregon, for slightly different reasons, have decided they want to put light rail on there. And that's not a problem that exists. It's not a problem with transit between the Portland metro area and the Vancouver area. There is a rapid bus transit system that works very well, that isn't, frankly, nowhere near capacity. You don't have to do anything to solve the transit problem, but this was an opportunity, an ideological opportunity, and it stalled the program, back in 2015 when there was a clear path forward to fund it and build it for a fraction of the cost. And here we are, 10 plus years later. We've gone right back. The Democrats have gone right back down the same ideological road and insisted on light rail. Still the same fundamental problems as the old bridge congestion problem. Those what we're going to fix. And now they got a bridge that. It's almost $15 billion is the proposal. There's no way we can afford to do that. Not only do we not have that money, even if we could come up with that money, that would pull money from projects all over the state that are also needed, including some really big projects like, the 405, the North-South Highway over in Spokane, the Trestle. These are all big projects that also need to be done. And instead of just narrowing down, prioritizing, let's get a fundamental bridge that is wide enough to deal with congestion. I'm not opposed if you want to make it, possible to put light rail on at some point in the future, but do that based on the science, do that based on the numbers, and do it in the order that priorities demand, which is build the bridge first for a much, much lower price, solve the problem in front of us. And then if you want to deal with a longer term issue, deal with it, but deal with it in a way that's honest and straightforward, that's approved by the voters, and really gets after the true problem we have in front of us. That's
an interesting point. While the voters in the Seattle area approved light rail, the voters in Vancouver have not.
No, they've rejected, I think, 3 times now. They've said, no, we are not interested. And yet, this is something we see over and over. We have, kind of these, I would say elitists in the other party that say, hey, don't pay attention to the voters. We know better. And they don't know better. If they knew, and as a result, we haven't solved this problem after, over 20 years of working on it.
I haven't heard Republicans, some people say Republicans are anti-transit. I don't know that that's true, but, at the same time, you got to be realistic, right? I mean, is that kind of where there's the disconnect for majority Democrats? You have these kind of pie-in-the-sky dreams of, like, fixing congestion on I-5 with light rail, but, I-5 is still pretty congested, and light rail. I've taken light rail. I take them to the Mariners games or whatever. It's, I think people like it, and there's nothing wrong with it. But I mean, it's just it hasn't fixed the problem. It's super expensive. Is that you think when it comes to transportation? The same thing's true with bike lanes and all this stuff. I mean, while nice, expensive, and not really fixing the problem. Or maybe I'm wrong.
That's right. I mean, they're focused on the nice to have, not the need to have things. And if we just got back, and I start with what you said, I'm not anti-transit. I just want transit. If we're going to have transit, have it based on the actual usage. Have to have it based on actual delivering a public good, not just an ideological wish list. I mean, they have this build it and they will come mentality. If we just build it, and then of course there's a side issue that they've been repeatedly dishonest with the public about what it's going to cost, and it's in the case of light rail up in Seattle, it's gone over and over and over the original cost, and the same looks to be true with where they're trying to head down here on the Columbia, the bridge over the Columbia on I-5. And then the numbers don't support. I mean, it could be the most wonderful system in the world, but if the public's not using it, if it's not solving the problem, then we got it wrong. And it's very clear that we're getting it wrong, that we are investing not just tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, but billions of dollars in infrastructure for transit and bike lanes and pedestrian things, and none of them bad, but none of them solving the fundamental problem that is making life here in Washington state less attractive.
In the old days of newspapers, the kind that you open up and read, not the kind you can get on your computer and read, the paper ones, the sports section was always last. So I'm going to end with a sports thing. Everybody in the Seattle area, I know you're a sports fan, hoping the Seattle Supersonics come back. Do you think some of these issues, the NBA will consider some of these issues, the cost issues, the tax issues when thinking about this? The general manager of the Seahawks said he got a couple of texts from agents who said, "Oh yeah, the good old days of you not having an income tax are gone. You can't use that as a selling point to come to Seattle anymore. You're on a level playing field because they call it a millionaire's tax, but." When you're talking about
it's an income
athletes,
tax.
Yeah, it's an income tax to athletes, right? It's like it could be someday an income tax to everybody. But I mean, let's just use these things as an example. I mean, could this be a problem for getting something like an NBA team?
Oh, based on the comments I've read, I think it very clearly is a problem, not just for a few expansion team for the NBA. But also for future success for our existing teams. I mean, Washington is a great sports state. I mean, we just had a terrific year, right? Both with the Mariners and the Seahawks. I mean, it's a great thing because it brings us together. You're not a Seahawks fan because you're a Republican or a Democrat. Yeah. You're just a Seahawks fan because you are, or the Mariners. And so that's a great thing about sports, and one of the remaining binding things in our country that I think I'm very interested in. This puts Seattle at a significant disadvantage, and we're going to have trouble getting the NBA team. We're going to have trouble recruiting the best players to come to our existing teams, and it didn't need to be that way. That's the frustrating part, is it didn't need to be this way. We and it's fading every day. Arguably the best or one of the best economies in the country. And the Democratic majority have systematically deconstructed that over the last several years, particularly in the last 2 years, with enormous new taxes, with more regulation, and it's forcing companies that don't want to leave here. We talked about Starbucks. We talk about others, don't want to leave here, but are faced with that situation with people who don't want to leave our great state, but are making a rational decision because we've made it too hard to succeed here in our state. And it's going to have long-lasting impacts, not just to the economy, but also, as you bring up, to things that you currently pull us together, like the Seattle Seahawks or the Seattle Mariners.
And hopefully someday the Seattle Supersonics again. Senator Braun's not going to be with us for a while. By a while, I mean a long while. He's because of election year restrictions, he won't be back with us until November. And the podcast will continue. Senator Chris Gildon has graciously accepted our invitation to come on and help host the program. And we'll have other legislators on as well and other people from the public as we continue this podcast. But, Senator, this podcast has been some pretty fun thing for us to do. I know that connecting with people is one of the things that you enjoy the most about this job. And the podcast is one opportunity to do that, but I know you continue to do that. I mean, is that something you like? Just out there talking? You talk to a lot of people now, just as part of this.
Yeah, I mean, this is not something I expected. I wouldn't characterize myself as a people person, but as I get around the district, talking to people, learning about their challenges, learning about their lives is always for me very motivational, inspiring. And this podcast we started, I guess almost 2 years ago now, not quite, has been a great way to get out and let folks know what's happening in our state, good and bad, and get them more involved in their state government. Because I think the more people we have involved, the better chance we have of good decisions and good outcomes in our state. So it's been a real joy to be on. Tracy, you've been terrific. And I've had to learn a lot in this process, but I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be on here. I'm sorry I can't be on, but the rules are the rules, and I'm going to follow them. So I wish you success over the next 6 months or so. Senator Gildon and I look forward to being back on when the rules allow.
Again, that's Senate Republican leader John Braun. I'm Tracy Ellis. This is the Elephant in the Dome, the official podcast of the Washington State Senate Republican Caucus.